All right, so let's talk about complementary and supplementary angles. First, complementary angles. Complementary angles are two angles whose sum is 90 degrees. So if we look at this first figure here, I have angle LMN measures 30 degrees, and angle RST measures 60 degrees, and 30 plus 60 is 90. So these two angles are complementary. Complementary angles can also look like the second figure here. When you look at angle ABC, you can see that it is a right angle. It measures 90 degrees. But it is made up of these two smaller angles, angle ABD and angle DBC. So that means that we know that these two smaller angles must be complementary because together they make this larger right angle. So whatever ABD measures plus whatever DBC measures has to equal 90 degrees. And you can use that very simply. If I tell you angle ABD measures 20 degrees, then you think, all right, well, 90 minus 20, that equals 70. So now I know that angle DBC must measure 70 degrees. Supplementary angles are the same concept as complementary angles, except in supplementary angles, the sum is 180 degrees. So you see here angle ABC measures 60 degrees, and angle DEF measures 120, and 60 plus 120 is 180. So these are supplementary angles. This also comes into effect with the concept of linear pair, which we learned about in the last lesson. We can see here that angle WXZ and angle ZXY form a linear pair. They make this straight angle, and a straight angle is 180 degrees. Therefore, these two angles are supplementary. This concept is called the linear pair postulate, which simply states that if two angles form a linear pair, then they are supplementary. And we can use that to find the measure of a missing angle. So if I tell you angle ZXY measures 70 degrees, then you could find the measure of angle WXZ simply by subtracting from 180. So 180 minus 70 is 110. So now we know this angle measures 110 degrees. One easy way to remember the difference between complementary and supplementary angles is complementary begins with the letter C, supplementary begins with the letter S. Complementary angles have a sum of 90, and supplementary angles have a sum of 180. So alphabetically, C comes before S, and numerically, 90 comes before 180. So let's go ahead and use these concepts to find some angle measures. Take a look at this first example here. We have angle ABD measures 55 degrees, angle EBC measures 45 degrees, but we do not know the measure of angle DBE. So what is X? Well, if we look carefully at these three angles, we see that these three angles together form a straight angle. So their sum must be 180. So we can find the measure of this angle, of X, by creating an equation. So we could say, all right, X plus 55 plus 45 equals 180. Well, 55 plus 45 is 100. So X plus 100 equals 180. And when we subtract 100 from both sides, we see that X equals 80. So now we know the measure of angle DBE is 80 degrees. In this next example, I can use the information given to find the measure of all of these other angles. So I know that this angle here measures 65 degrees, and I know that angle 2 is a right angle, so it measures 90 degrees. So how can I find the measure of angle 1? Well, if angle 2 is 90 degrees, and angle 2 combined with the 65 degree angle and angle 1 make this straight angle. So these three angles have to add together to make 180, which means if this side is 90, this side is 90 because 90 plus 90 is 180. So I can very simply subtract 90 minus 65, and I find that angle 1 measures 25 degrees. So let me write that right here. So the measure of angle 1 is 25 degrees. Well, If I know what the measure of angle 1 is, I know what the measure of angle 3 is, because angle 1 and angle 3 are vertical angles. So if the measure of angle 1 is 25 degrees, then the measure of angle 3 is also 25 degrees. And I can use that information to find the measure of angle 4, because if angle 3 is 25 degrees, well, angle 4 and angle 3 are a linear pair. That means they are supplementary. So I can subtract 180 minus 25, and I find that the measure of angle 4 is 155 degrees. All right, so now looking at this third figure down here, suppose I tell you that these two angles, let's call this angle X, and let's call this angle Y. Suppose I tell you that they are complementary angles, right? So they are complementary. So what that means is that the sum of these two angles, angle X, the measure of angle X, plus the measure of angle Y equals 90 degrees. So then angle X is 5x degrees, and angle Y is 6x plus 2 degrees. So how do we find or calculate the actual numerical value of these angle measures? Well, we can write an equation. So our equation would be angle X, the measure of angle X, 5x, plus the measure of angle Y, 6x plus 2. Since they are complementary, that has to equal 90 degrees. And we could just solve our equation. I can combine like terms here. 5x plus 6x is 11x plus 2 equals 90. Subtract 2 from both sides. And I get 11x equals 88. And we know that 88 divided by 11 is 8. So we know that x equals 8. So now, the measure of angle X is 5x, and 5 times 8 equals 40. So the measure of angle X is 40 degrees. And since they're complementary, that means the measure of angle Y should be 50 degrees, because 40 plus 50 is 90. But let's work it out. So we have 6 times 8 plus 2. So 6 times 8 plus 2. And 6 times 8 is 48. And 48 plus 2 is 50 degrees. So the measure of angle Y is 50 degrees. All right, now let's talk about the congruent complements theorem. This could be a little tricky to understand, but if you break it down piece by piece, you should be able to get it. The congruent complements theorem says, if two angles are complements of the same angle or of congruent angles, then the two angles are congruent. So let's see what that means. Let's take a look at this first example here. Let's suppose that I tell you that angle A and angle B are complementary. I'm just going to write comp here. And I also tell you that angle B and angle C are also complementary. Well, what does that tell us about the relationship between angle A and angle C? Well, let me show you with numbers so you can see what I'm talking about. Let's say angle A measures 30 degrees. So if angle A and angle B are complementary, that would mean angle B would have to measure 60 degrees. So now, if angle B and angle C are also complementary and angle B is 60 degrees, that would mean that angle C also has to measure 30 degrees, because 60 plus 30 is 90. So if angle A and angle B are complementary and angle B and angle C are complementary, then angle A is congruent to angle C. And that's this part here of if two angles are complements of the same angle, then the two angles are congruent. Look at this second example here. Suppose I tell you that angle 1 and angle 2 are complementary. And I also tell you that angle 3 and angle 4 are also complementary. And I give you one more piece of information, and that piece of information is that angle 2 is congruent to angle 3. So what does that tell me about angles 1 and 4? Let's take a look. Again, let's say that angle 1 measures 30 degrees. That would mean angle 2 would have to measure 60 degrees. And if I know that angle 2 is congruent to angle 3, that means that angle 3 also measures 60 degrees, which would make angle 4 equal to 30 degrees because 3 and 4 are complementary. So, if angle 1 and angle 2 are complementary, and angle 3 and angle 4 are complementary, and angle 2 is congruent to angle 3, what does that tell me about angle 1 and angle 4? That tells me that they are also congruent. So let's go ahead and take a look at this concept as a two-column proof. We see our figure here, angles 1, 2, 3, and 4, and so we have our givens. So given angle 1 and angle 2 are complements, and that angle 3 and angle 4 are complements, and that angle 2 is congruent to angle 3, prove that angle 1 is congruent to angle 4. So let's take a look at our statements and our reasons, and I've already filled some of these in. Statement number 1, angle 1 and angle 2 are complementary, that is given. Statement 2, angle 3 and angle 4 are complementary, that is given. Statement 3, angle 2 is congruent to angle 3, that is given. So, statement 4, angle 1, the measure of angle 1 plus the measure of angle 2 equals what? Well, if they're complementary, we know that that sum is 90 degrees. And what's our reason? Our reason would be the definition of complementary angles. I don't have that room, so I'm just going to put def of comp. Hopefully you understand what that means. Well then, so what do we have here for number 5? The measure of angle 3 plus the measure of angle 4. They're both complementary, so again, that is 90 degrees. And again, our reason is definition of complementary angles. All right, so on to statement number 6. We know that the measure of angle 1 plus the measure of angle 2 is 90 degrees, and that measure of angle 3 plus the measure of angle 4 is 90 degrees. So we can say the measure of angle 1 plus the measure of angle 2 is equal to the measure of angle 3 plus the measure of angle 4. And that is the substitution property. Now we know that the measure of angle 2 is equal to the measure of angle 3 because they are congruent. So, definition of congruence. So we can use that to substitute into our previous statement from number 6, where I have measure of angle 1 plus the measure of angle 2 is equal to, and here, instead of saying the measure of angle 3, I'm going to say the measure of angle 2 plus the measure of angle 4. Again, since angle 2 and angle 3 are equal, that means I can use angle 2 instead of angle 3, and that is the substitution property again. Now, solving this as an equation, if I were to subtract the measure of angle 2 from both sides, then I would be left with the measure of angle 1 is equal to the measure of angle 4. And that is the subtraction property of equality. Just going to put subtraction prop. And since I know that the measure of angle 1 is equal to measure 4, I have now proven that angle 1 is congruent to angle 4, and that is the definition of congruence. All right, so now on to the congruent supplements theorem, which is basically the same thing except involving supplementary angles. So if two angles are the supplements of the same angle or of congruent angles, then the two angles are congruent. So looking at this first figure here, if I tell you that angle A and angle B are supplementary, and I also tell you that angle B and angle C are supplementary, well, what does that tell me? That tells me that angle A is congruent to angle C. Now, why do I know that? Again, if angle A here is 60 degrees, then angle B must be 120 degrees because they are supplementary. And if angle B is 120 degrees, then angle C must be 60 degrees because they are both supplementary. So that's how I know that angle A is congruent to angle C, because if two angles are the supplements of the same angle, then the two angles are congruent. So looking at the second figure here, if I tell you that angle 1 and angle 2 are supplementary, and I tell you that angle 3 and angle 4 are also supplementary, and then I tell you that angle 2 is congruent to angle 3. So what does that tell us about angle 1 and angle 4? It tells us that they are also congruent. Angle 1 is also congruent to angle 4. And again, if angle 1 is 110 degrees, then angle 2 has to be 70 degrees because 110 plus 70 is 180. And if angle 2 and angle 3 are congruent, that means angle 3 is also 70 degrees, which means angle 4 would have to be 110 degrees because it is supplementary with angle 3. So therefore, if angle 1 and angle 2 are supplementary, and angle 3 and angle 4 are supplementary, and angle 2 is congruent to angle 3, that means angle 1 is also congruent to angle 4. So let's take a look at a two-column proof for this concept. We take a look at this figure here, and it says given angle 1 and angle 2 are supplements. So here's angle 1 and angle 2. They are supplementary. And angle 1 and angle 4 are supplements. So angle 1 and angle 4 are also supplementary. And we're also given that angle 2 measures 50 degrees. So given that information, we need to prove that angle 4 also equals 50 degrees. So let's take a look at our statements. Statement 1, angle 1 and angle 2 are supplements, given. Statement 2, angle 1 and angle 4 are supplements, given. Statement 3, angle 2 equals 50 degrees, that is also given. So if angle 1 and angle 2 are supplementary, and angle 1 and angle 4 are supplementary, then what else do we know? Well, we know that angle 2 is congruent to angle 4. And why do we know that? Because of the congruent supplements theorem that we just learned about. So if angle 2 is congruent to angle 4, that means that the measure of angle 2 is equal to the measure of angle 4, and that is the definition of congruence. So if the measure of angle 2 is equal to the measure of angle 4, then we have proven that the measure of angle 4 is 50 degrees, and that is thanks to the substitution property.